A man once said that the worst kept secret in church history is that most people, and he even said most Christians, do not like to pray. And I think that's somewhat of a bold accusation to make against people in general, or especially against Christians in general, and I don't know if I can 100% get behind what he's saying there. But what he said following that, I think, helps explain what he was trying to get at. He continued to say, don't get me wrong, we still do it mainly out of guilt or obligation, or because we know it's good for us, making prayer the spiritual equivalent of eating celery. And I think maybe if we're being honest with ourselves, sometimes maybe our prayer life does start out in the sense that we do it because it makes us happy. We do it because we know that we're communicating with God and that excites us. But I think even as he said, maybe with time, it moves away from that. And maybe it even comes to a point to where it's more so that you're praying because you haven't been, and therefore you feel guilty, therefore you're obligated, and now maybe you pray more to God, making it the spiritual equivalent to eating celery because we know it's good for us. Well, the same individual said this. He said, whoever we are is all that we are when we are on our knees in prayer. And I think what he's trying to say there is the most that we could ever be in this life and the most that we could ever accomplish in this life is when we are communicating with God and we are seeking Him and we're casting our cares and petitions upon His ear. And if I think about verses like Matthew chapter 7, verses 7 and 8, seek you will find, knock the door will be open unto you, ask and you shall receive. And I understand what Jesus is saying there. And I also take into consideration 1 John chapter 5, verses 14 and 15, where he says, if I ask within the will of God, those things that I ask for, I will receive. Right? And I understand and I know those to be truths. But I might have to ask myself, how much have I limited what I am capable of? How much have I limited who I am simply because of how little I seek God's providential hand in my life through prayer? And I think that we understand that the Scriptures are true. That He is pleading with us to cast our cares and our concerns upon Him, knowing that He is there to hear us and He wants to hear from us. Yet our prayer lives are still probably enough to give us spiritual whiplash at times, through the highs and lows of our own inconsistencies in our communication with God. Because sometimes we're completely engaged and we're completely active in prayer, while other times we may feel as if we're just merely going through the motions of prayer. And even when our prayer life is going really good, we would likely admit that it could still be better, that we could be more active, that it could be more frequent, that we could be more in touch, that it could be more in depth, that it could be more constant and more in tune with our Maker. Because too often our prayer life is simply eating the spiritual celery. Because we know that it's good for us and we feel the sense of obligation out of this sense of guilt rather than because we truly enjoy it. A man once said that most of us get about knee deep into our prayer life and we discover that the water feels fine and we stop there. And we never swim into the depths of the divine intimacy that Jesus won for us. And I think maybe that is the case, that we get knee deep into our prayer life and we get satisfied with that, what is mediocre, and rather than diving into the depths of the prayer life that Jesus wants to have with Him, we stop right there and we're comfortable there. I think it's important for us to understand that God never intended for us to stay in the shallow end, but rather He invites us to dive head first, to plunge into the depths of prayer life that He would desire us to have. I mean, you think about verses like Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 16. And we often look at this in the sense of prayer and communication to God. And the Hebrew writer says that we are to come boldly before the throne of grace. Think about Luke chapter 11 and verse 1. I think about how the disciples of Jesus asked Jesus Himself to teach them how to pray even as He prays. Now, let it be known, this request was not made because Jesus tiptoed around in His conversations with God, but rather His prayers reflected His ability to plunge headfirst deep into conversation with God, to show His complete trust, His complete dependency, and His faith toward the Father in which He prayed to. Well, just like His disciples, we still today should desire the ability to understand how to pray like our Savior, to show that kind of commitment to that kind of depth of communication that God desires of us. And the real question is, how do I do it? How do I begin to pray even like my Savior and to show that kind of commitment, that kind of trust, that kind of faith in the one of whom I am praying to? 3 things I want us to consider. Think about this first. Turn, if you will, to Psalm 46 and verse 10. Slow down and give time to prayer. Now, these points, they're not going to be anything that you wouldn't think of yourself, but I think it's something that we at least need to consider because it's very important to our prayer life. Slow down and give time to prayer. You likely know the verse, Psalm 46 and verse 10. Be still and know that I am God. One of the greatest obstacles between us and a prayer life like that of Jesus is our inability to simply be still. Turn, if you will, to Exodus chapter 14. Exodus chapter 14. And think about the situation where we find Israel backed up against the Red Sea, and they recognize that the armies of the Egyptians are closing in upon them after Moses and Aaron have taken them out of the bondage of Egypt and have started their way toward the Red Sea. They get to the edge of the Red Sea, and watch what happens. Exodus chapter 14, pick up in verse 8. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and pursued the children of Israel. And the children of Israel went out with boldness. So they leave Egypt with boldness. Verse 9, so the Egyptians pursued them, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen and his army, and overtook them camping by the sea. All right, verse 10. And when Pharaoh drew near, watch this, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. Mark what they did here. So they were afraid, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. I think that's important. They at least noticed that they needed to cry out to the Lord. But watch what they continue to do in their panic. Verse 11. Then they said to Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt so with us to bring us out of Egypt? Right? They're going to turn around and say, we were better off in Egypt. We were better off slaves. And watch the instruction that's given to them. Verse 13, Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. Stand still. Just be still. And see the salvation of the Lord which he has accomplished for you today. Look at verse 14. The Lord will fight for you. And watch what he says. You shall hold your peace. They recognized the necessity to call upon the Lord, but they could not stop their feet. They could not stop shuffling about. Simply be still. He says, be still and know that I am the Lord. You think about that first subpoint there in the first point. Stop shuffling your feet and be still. Simply that. Stop shuffling your feet and be still. I remember when I was a kid and playing in little leagues, my dad was a head coach, and we had this guy on our team who had a real problem with keeping his feet still. As a matter of fact, when he would get into the batter's box, he would start kind of tiptoeing around, and he would get real antsy because he was nervous about the pitch that was coming to him. And before the pitcher ever finished his windup, he would step right out of the box. And my dad kept telling him, be still, keep your feet still. So finally he asked the assistant coach, he said, hey, will you lay down behind him in practice and hold his feet in the box? And he did, and he made him stand there, and he made him be still, and guess what? He was able to hit the ball. But he had to get past this desire, this want to shuffle his feet, to move around, and to be still. Well, sometimes I think it's very much the same for us mentally and physically. There's so many distractions around us that we forget sometimes we just need to be still. If we're really going to have the prayer life that we need to have. You think about Mark chapter 4, verse 35 through 38. Mark chapter 4, verse 35 through 38. Jesus and his disciples have found themselves in the midst of a storm on the sea, right? And Jesus himself has pillowed his head. He's sleeping peacefully. And his disciples are running about frantic. They can't stop moving their feet. They're scared. They're terrified. And they wake Jesus up and they say, look, do you not care? Are you not concerned that we are perishing? You know what he tells them? Peace. Be still. Simply be still. Psalm 23, verses 1 through 3. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me by what? Still waters. Waters of peace. And you know what it says in verse 3? And it restores the soul. Sometimes we just simply need to slow down and be still if we really want to have the prayer life and the communication to God that He desires us to have with Him. And you would think that the instruction to simply be still would be that simple. Yet we've made it much more complicated than what it sounds. Because the way of life that we have grown accustomed to is actually historically abnormal. And I think it's important to understand that. The way of life that we have grown accustomed to is historically abnormal. It's not always been the case, right? People have not always been as busy as we are today. They were better at being still in times past. The busyness, the rushing around that we experience on a daily basis, it's not always been the norm. But it's the very busyness that we are so engaged in that cripples us from being able to be still. One of the books I was reading here recently, the man said this. He was speaking about the busyness of our world and just how much we get consumed by it. And he said there's these three things over history that led to ourselves making our lives so busy. And he pointed to the first one in 1370. He said the first clock was set up in Germany, the first public clock. And at this time, people began to operate more so on artificial time than they did natural time. And what he meant by that was they were no longer just waking up when the sun came up and going to bed when the sun went down. And of course, we get much more sleep than we do. But they were watching the clock. And they were trying to fit every minute of every hour into every day as much as they could cram pack into those hours of light. They became focused on that time. All right? The second thing he said, in 1879, Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. Right? So now we can go on even into the night hours and we can stay busy during those hours with more distractions and more complications in life and be more busy. And then, of course, in 2007, the release of the first iPhone, where we can be completely still, outside of one finger, and be completely preoccupied and busy for hours upon hours. An inability to simply be still. And we've made ourselves that way. He says, be still and know that I am God. Listen, if I'm going to have the prayer life like Jesus, I have to be willing to be still, but I also have to be willing to seek a place of solitude. Seek a place where it's quiet. Seek a place of solitude. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever found yourself rushing through a prayer because there was something you didn't want to miss? Some distraction you didn't want to miss out on? So you rush through your prayer to make sure you don't miss out what's going on around you? Right? We've all been there. I believe part of our problem is that we clutter our lives with so many responsibilities and so many distractions that it has become our norm to seek God amid all of the noise and all of the commotion and all the busyness that life has to offer, rather than seeking the place of solitude and going to Him in the quiet. If we're seeking to have a prayer life like that of Jesus, we must be willing to seek solitude and quiet for some of our prayers. I know we can't do it for all of them, but we have to at least be willing to do it for some of them. In Luke chapter 5, it says that Jesus frequently, Luke chapter 5, verse 16, it says that He frequently withdrew to the wilderness to pray. Now, why would He do that? He would do that to get away from the distractions. He would do that so it could be a more intimate conversation between Him and God, to remove Himself from the noise and the busyness of the day. Mark chapter 6, you remember Jesus and the feeding of the 5,000 in Mark chapter 6? All these people, all this commotion, all this excitement, all this distraction. And there's three things that Jesus did following the feeding of the 5,000. One, He told His disciples to go on in a boat, go to the other side to Bethsaida. Secondly, He told the multitudes to depart, remove them from Himself. In Mark chapter 6, in verse 46, it says He departed to the mountain to pray. A place of solitude, away from the noise. away from people, away from distractions. And I want us to understand it was not the case that there was not a demand for the time of Jesus. Right? In John chapter 6, John speaks of this same event in the feeding of the 5,000. In John chapter 6 and verse 15, it says, "Therefore when Jesus perceived that they were about to make him king by force," right, there was a demand for his time, a demand for his attention. It says he departed again. Again, meaning this was not the first time, but he's done this multiple times before. He departed again to the mountain to be by himself alone, to pray. Be willing to stand still. Stop shuffling your feet. Seek a place of solitude and pray. You know, I don't know that we have them that much here. I believe I've seen one in this area. The ant mounds, the big ones that have those big red fire ants. You see them more so down in the hill country, down in South Texas. And you can stand over one of these ant mounds, and it's almost like you're towering over them, right? Because they're so small in comparison to us. And you watch them from daylight to dark. They just move about frantically, nonstop. They're busy, they're busy, they're busy, they're working. And you can actually take like a stick or something of that nature and throw it down in front of their path. And they will merely hesitate, but for a moment. And they're either going to go around or they're going to go over, but they're going to keep moving. And I often wonder if from God's perspective, if it's not somewhat similar. Even when the obstacles are thrown down before our lives, that we just hesitate for a moment to barely communicate with Him, and then we continue with our frantic, busy lives. Be still. Second point. Give thought to who you are talking to. Back in Psalm 46, in verse 10, same verse, give thought to who you are talking to. Be still and know that I am God, he says. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in all the earth. Give thought to who you are talking to. You know, I was once invited here in the past year or so. I was invited by a man to go listen to a preacher preach at a tent revival type thing. Now, I knew this man to be a religious man, but he was not of the Lord's church. And I carried on conversation with him just to kind of see what kind of conversation we could get into. And I asked a little bit about this preacher that he spoke of, and he told me this. He said, man, you wouldn't believe it. He's so close to God. He's so in touch, so in tune with God, he calls him Daddy. I said, what? It's like, we're not talking about the same being. That's somebody completely different. That's not how I address my God. I couldn't imagine thinking of it in that sense. Think about who you're talking to. Right? Remember verses like Isaiah chapter 40, verse 28 and 29. Isaiah says, have you not known? Have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, neither faints nor is weary. We're not talking about the same being. Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 17, Moses speaking in regard to God, he says, the Lord your God is God of gods, Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome. Do you really think about who it is that you're in conversation with, that you're communicating with? I believe we know these verses to be true. And I firmly believe that we would never intentionally address God in a way that belittles who He is. But I do think it's very possible that through the common practice of prayer and the common knowledge of who He is, that when we address Him, He's simply our Father on some throne in heaven. And we lose sight of the magnitude of the one whom we're casting our cares and concerns upon. You see, when I really think about who I'm talking to, I really begin to think about how capable He is. A man once said, sometimes our spiritual amnesia is our greatest struggle in our prayers, almost as if God has to audition for us every time we face a hardship, because we forget who it is that we're communicating with. I want us to think about this by way of illustration, because when we hit our knees in prayer, we're petitioning upon the Creator of the universe, the God of the heavens, Yahweh, the great I Am. We're petitioning upon Him to intervene providentially in our lives. Let's illustrate this. Think about how capable He is. There is the singular universe, right? The universe that we know it. It is the totality of space, time, matter, and energy, the framework within which everything exists, and it is said to be some 470 million times bigger than the Milky Way galaxy. That's the universe. All right, well, there's also the Milky Way galaxy of which we are in. Our galaxy, which is one of 200 billion galaxies that exist within the observable universe. And then there is, of course, our solar system, which is one of the estimated 4,000 planetary systems that exist within our galaxy. All right, kind of puts things into perspective. Well, let's think about the size of these things. The Milky Way galaxy, if it were that everything in it were shrunk down together at the same rate, and you were able to fit the Milky Way galaxy into something the size of the entire continent of North America, our solar system would fit into a coffee cup. That's the size comparison. I don't know if you've read about it or seen it, but you know there are 2 space voyagers traveling across space, really with no end in sight, and they've been doing so for almost 50 years, traveling at about 35,000 miles per hour. Just to put that into perspective, if you were to circle our globe just above the tops of the mountain peaks, it's about 25,000 miles in circumference. So at the rate they're traveling, they could loop around the earth 1 1/3 times every hour. That's how fast they're traveling. And they've been doing this for some 15.5 billion years. They've made it outside of our solar system, but just barely. And they're still traveling with no end in sight. Now, when NASA sends communication to these spacecrafts, it takes about 22.5 hours for the data to reach the crafts. 22.5 hours for the data to return back to NASA. Now, based upon that data, the scientists have estimated that to send a speed of light message to the edge of the universe would take more than about 15 billion years. Yet the God who created it hears our pleas and hears our cries the second that they leave our lips. The moment that we imagine them within our minds. Is that the God that you have in mind when you go to Him in prayer? Is that the magnitude of the being that you think of when you cast your cares and your petitions upon Him? You see, when I really give the thought of who it is that I'm talking to, I can't help but to be reminded of just how capable He is, but also remember just how incapable I myself am. Remember how incapable you are. If you really want to put trust in Him, realize how much you need Him and how much you depend upon Him. Turn over to Psalm 8 to tie in with this thought, even considering the cosmos. Psalm 8 verses 3 and 4, it ties directly to the thoughts at hand. Psalm 8 in verse 3, when I consider your heavens, the framework of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you're mindful of him? What is man that you visit him? And I think it's a humbling reminder of just how small and just how fragile we actually are, and how vast and how amazing and how powerful the one of whom we cast our cares and concerns upon is. When Job was humbled by God in Job 38, Job thought he had the answers. He thought he had understanding, and God humbled him. What was it that God said to Job? To reality check him, to remind him of just how small he actually was. Do you remember he gave this idea of the dimensions, the measurements of this great mass we call earth, right? He's telling Job about these things, and he says, who laid out the dimensions of this place? And then he went on to speak of the vastness of the expanse beyond his little existence when he spoke of the constellations of the stars in the skies. And then he reminded him of the beast that no man could slay, but yet God could. Reality check. A little reminder about how capable God is and how incapable Job was. It's good for us to think about those things. You see, when I see him clearly, I'm reminded of just how small and just how fragile I am. A man once said, there is a good kind of small, and it comes with wonder at the God who is big enough to breathe the cosmos into existence, to maintain its structure and functionality by the power of His Word, yet personal enough to care about me in the events of my day-to-day life. Think about who it is that you're talking to. Think about who it is that you're asking to intervene providentially in your life. Be still, He says, and know that I am God. Third point, to help us better have a prayer life like that of Jesus, give thought to who you are. Be still, give time for prayer, give thought to who He is, and give thought to who you are. Look at Psalm 139. Psalm 139, and it's another verse that I think we know very likely, might even be able to quote it. So Psalm 39, verse 23. Psalm 139, verse 23. The psalmist writes, "Search me, O God, know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties, and see if there is any wicked way within me, and lead me in the way of everlasting." You see, one of the things that we have to search within ourselves is the ability to be completely transparent before God. Because I think too often it is the case that maybe we try to lay down before Him what we ought to be, rather than lay down before Him what is actually in us. And maybe we avoid certain conversations in our prayer because we think, I don't want to talk to God about that, as if He doesn't already know. We need to be willing to be completely transparent. A man once wrote this. He said, "The way our motives change isn't by working on them in silence. It's through such brutal honesty with God that He, by prayer, can help you refine your motives." You see, I have to be willing to be transparent. You think about David, Psalm 10, verse 1, Psalm 13, verse 1, Psalm 22, verse 1, how he spoke of how God seemed distant. This was something that he felt, something that he experienced. He felt that God was not there, that He did not hear him, that he was abandoned in some sense, but he was willing to voice it to God. He was willing to be brutally honest about what he felt inside. Listen, if we feel like we are incapable, we need to voice that. If we feel like we're completely capable, we need to voice it. If we feel like we're lacking, if we feel like we're well supplied, if we have weaknesses, if we have concerns, we have to be willing to be honest, completely transparent. In Psalm 22, David, he spoke how he felt like nothing more than a worm. He was so ashamed at that moment in his life, he felt like nothing more than a worm. Would you voice that to God? You see, because if we're willing to voice those things, we might figure out how to get out of that situation. Maybe it's the case that through some of our prayers, there's certain things that we avoid in prayer. And if that's the case, that's not transparency at all. Rather, that's avoidance. And we have to be willing to speak with Him honestly about our feelings, about our emotions, about our experiences. And we can't hold nothing back. If I really want to have a prayer life like that of Jesus, I cannot hold anything back. You know, we often speak about Jesus' prayer in the garden and how He cried out to God and how He said, basically speaking, the idea that He did not necessarily want to go through with what He was going to endure. It was going to be hard. It was going to be difficult. It was going to be painful. But nonetheless, not my will be done, but yours. And we emphasize that part of it. Not my will be done, but yours. And we skip right over the fact that Jesus was willing to express the weakness of His flesh, so much so that He did not necessarily want to go through with that hardship. But He was willing to do it because He trusted in God. Listen, it may be the case that even in your everyday work life, maybe it is that you are surrounded by people who do not want to hear about your God, who do not want to hear about your faith, and they continually say things that belittle it. They continually say things that make you want to hide behind something and not speak anything about God or your faith. Do you go to God and tell Him about your weakness? Or do you act as if it's not there and refuse to talk about it through prayer, thinking that He does not already know about it? You see, if I want to overcome my weaknesses, I have to be willing to speak to Him about my weaknesses. Jesus laid it all bare. Raw, unfiltered emotions, experiences, weaknesses, strengths. If I want a prayer life like His, I have to be willing to examine myself and be willing to be honest with what I see when I speak to God, because He already knows. You know, David, when he talked about how he felt abandoned, how he felt that God was distant, maybe it's the case you found yourself in that situation. Will you pray to God and say, where are you? Why do you seem distant? Do you know through that conversation it might be the case that all of a sudden you realize what it is that you've done to make Him feel so distant? And through communication, you work through that problem. Those are just 3 simple things. And we could go so much further. 3 simple things to help us better have a prayer life like Jesus. Here's the thing. It may be the case that you struggle with it on a daily basis, like probably most of us. It may be the case that just about every other day you feel like maybe you're not praying enough and you're trying to do more. Maybe it's the case that you lose the words. You can't think of what to say. Give it more time. Remove yourself from the distractions. Find a place of solitude. Be honest with yourself. Be honest with Him. And continue in your life of prayer and continue to build that life of prayer. Trust in Him and have faith in Him. Maybe it's this morning you need prayer. Maybe it's the case that you struggle in this area, and hey, what better way to try and help gain strength in this but to have the prayers of the congregation praying before you. Maybe it's the case that you've wandered back into sin and God does seem distant because of your own actions, and maybe prayer needs to be had to help bring about repentance. Maybe it's the case that you're not even a child of God yet, but you want to enter into that relationship with Him. We can help you with that also. Whatever the case may be, from this point forward, move forward knowing that you have a set time. Maybe it's the case that you have to set an alarm so that you know that you will pray at these times during the day. Whatever the case may be, set the alarm. Make it consistent. Because if it's not consistent, it's not a habit. It's inconsistency. Take time, slow down, go to solitude, pray to God, be completely open and honest with Him. If you have need this morning, please let it be known as together we stand as we sing.